Good morning. I'm Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School of Government, and it's my pleasure to welcome back to this forum Warren Christopher, our Secretary of State, for what will be his third address here at the Kennedy School. We're very privileged that Secretary Christopher has chosen to speak here because Secretary Christopher represents what this school stands for, which is devotion to public service, whether one is in or out of government. Let me just read you some of his accomplishments and illustrate what I mean. He, after graduation from the University of Southern California in 1945, spent a year on active duty in the Pacific, in the Naval Reserves, attended Stanford Law School, where he was president of the Law Review, then clerked for Justice William Douglas of the U.S. Supreme Court. After that, went to private practice at Melvin & Myers in 1950, where he's been associated ever since and will return there after this period as Secretary of State. But his practice of law was interspersed with periods of government service, including Deputy Attorney General of the United States from 67 to 69, Deputy Secretary of State from 77 to 81, where I had the pleasure of working with him on many issues, but I think he will always be remembered for those very difficult negotiations he carried out, which led to the release of the 52 American hostages in Iran. In recognition of his accomplishments, he was awarded the Medal of Freedom by President Carter in 1981. In 1991, Warren Christopher serves as the chairman of the Independent Commission on the Los Angeles Police Department, appointed in the aftermath of the Rodney King incident, and was responsible for many of the necessary and welcome reforms there. He was director of President Clinton's transition, and then was selected to be Secretary of State beginning in January 1993. He's guided American foreign policy with a sure hand during a period where we've had a great deal of turmoil and uncertainty in the world. He told me as we were chatting that he has traveled something like 765,000 miles in 4 years, having accompanied him on a few of those trips, and marveled at his stamina. I think his fellow citizens owe him a great debt of gratitude for his stamina, but also for his common sense, his wisdom, and his fine management of our foreign policy. We are proud to welcome back Warren Christopher.
Good morning or good afternoon, and hello to all of you way up there as well as down here in front of me. It's great to be here again. I want to thank Joe Nye for that very generous introduction. It was a real privilege for me to serve in government with such an able and distinguished scholar as Joe Nye, who left us with a legacy of very important contributions. His contribution, along with those of many, many other members of the Kennedy School faculty, are really shining examples of this school's commitment to public service, and I congratulate all of you who are involved in that extremely important endeavor. As Joe said, this is the third straight year I've had an opportunity to speak with you, and I want to thank you for welcoming me so warmly again. You know, a few years ago, I promised myself I would keep coming up to Boston every January until the Patriots made it to the Super Bowl. Well, now that I've kept my promise, I'm able to go home, and I'm ready to do so. But before I do that, I want to reflect on the record of these last 4 years and to focus on the investments we must make to sustain American leadership and American engagement in the world. When our administration took office in 1993, we faced an array of challenges that required urgent attention. At that time, Russia's democracy was in crisis. Its economy was near collapse. The nuclear arsenal of the former Soviet Union was scattered among 4 new countries with very few safeguards. The war in Bosnia was at the peak of its brutality and threatening to spread. North Korea was developing nuclear weapons. The Middle East peace process was stalemated. Negotiations were stymied. Repression in Haiti was pushing refugees to our shores. NAFTA's passage was in serious doubt, threatening our relations with the entire hemisphere. Not all at once, but step by step over the last 4 years, we've resolved these pressing questions and built an enduring basis for our engagement in a more secure and more prosperous world. Indeed, it was in this period with our leadership that the world of the 21st century really began to take shape. It is a world where no great power views any other as an immediate military threat, a world where the institutions we built after World War II are being adapted to meet new challenges, a world where open societies and open markets have a strong competitive advantage, a world where America remains the indispensable nation. A new and distinctive element of our strategy has been the priority we've attached to addressing emerging global issues like proliferation, terrorism, international crime, drug trafficking, and damage to the environment. These transnational issues simply cannot be adequately addressed by traditional country-to-country diplomacy or even on a regional basis. Global problems require global solutions. We began to address these problems in 1993 by appointing the first Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs with the charge to focus on many of these issues. I believe that the progress we have made since in this field will be seen as one of the principal legacies of the Clinton presidency and I hope of my term as Secretary of State. A central part of our global strategy has been to ensure that weapons of mass destruction do not threaten the American people. That's why we worked so hard to extend indefinitely the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and to secure the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. It is why we have a program in place to keep nuclear weapons in the former Soviet Union from falling into the hands of terrorists or rogue states. It is why we acted to freeze and eventually eliminate the North Korean nuclear program. It is why we have been determined to shut down Iraq's biological weapons program, and it is why over the next several months the President and our administration will press hard for the ratification of the Chemical Weapons Convention. Just as important, we are confronting the new security threats that have emerged with such clarity since the end of the Cold War. We put the fight against terror, drugs, and crime at the top of the agenda of the G7 as well as the United Nations. As a result, law enforcement cooperation among nations is stronger than ever before. Major terrorists have been caught, and many acts of terrorism have been prevented from occurring. I've also made it a personal priority to integrate environmental issues into every aspect of our diplomacy. In my travels around the world that Joe Nye spoke of, I've been startled by the overcrowded, massive, bursting cities I've seen in so many parts of the world. Great cities like Sao Paulo and Mexico City, Jakarta, Manila, and Cairo, cities where overpopulation and pollution threaten the health and welfare of nations and regions. To take another point of the importance of the environment, I've seen in the Middle East how shortage of water is a potential source of grave conflict. In the new independent states of the former Soviet Union, I've been struck by the ruinous impact of pollution on public health, on life expectancy, and on the prospect for economic recovery. A few years ago, these environmental issues were barely on our screen. Now they're in the mainstream of diplomacy, and I believe will become even more central in the next century. Another legacy, a lasting legacy, I believe, of the President's first term will be the record we forged in advancing our economic interests. Thanks to the Uruguay round and NAFTA, tariffs on U.S. exports are lower than ever before. Thanks to our over 200 new market opening agreements, we have created 1.6 million new American jobs. Thanks to the free trade commitments we forged in our own hemisphere, as well as across the Pacific, we have an opportunity to become the hub of a dynamic open marketplace that stretches from Chile to Canada, from Australia to Korea. We simply must not squander that marvelous chance to invigorate trade in our hemisphere and in the Pacific. In every region of the world, our leadership has been decisive in advancing our interests and ideals. Across the Atlantic, we're on the verge of building a stable, democratic, and undivided Europe. American leadership ended the war in Bosnia, and it is winning the peace. We have led the reinvigoration and transformation of NATO. All of Europe's new democracies have joined the Partnership for Peace, and this year NATO will invite several to begin negotiations, historic negotiations, to join NATO, the world's greatest military alliance in history. At critical moments, we've stood by democracy in Russia, and we've opened the door for its integration, including the door to negotiating a new charter with NATO. Asia, too, is entering the next century, prosperous, at peace, and with new structures of cooperation designed to keep it that way. Again, our leadership has been indispensable. We have provided stability by maintaining our military presence in the Pacific, strengthening our cornerstone alliance with Japan, and standing with South Korea against the provocations from the North. We have provided vision by leading APEC to embrace open trade. We've worked with China to advance the vital interests we share, even as we address our very serious differences with China over issues like human rights. In the Middle East, we're closer to realizing our goal of a comprehensive peace. Our diplomacy was vital in helping Israel reach the agreements with the Palestinians in 1993, in 1994, and 1995, as well as the peace treaty with Jordan. We helped open a new dimension of the peace process by galvanizing the economic summits at Casablanca, Amman, and Cairo, and encouraging important steps toward more normalized relations between Israel and its neighbors in the Arab world. While peace has faced many severe tests in recent months, the achievements in that region are enduring, and we are determined to move forward. The agreement on Hebron and other issues reached last night is really an extraordinary achievement. It demonstrates that there is a powerful logic to peace, an imperative powerful enough to overcome the setbacks and hesitations of recent months. The protocol on Hebron and the U.S. drafted note for the record are a clear roadmap for the future of the peace negotiations. They set forth commitments and a time frame for both Israel and the Palestinians, a commitment and time frame to implement the agreements that they've already reached and need to carry forward now. The note for the record also fixes a time for the commencement of the vital negotiations on the final status issues. Now that the parties have taken this difficult step for peace, they must not relax or step back in fatigue. They must use this new momentum to move ahead to build the peace that is in the common interests of the Israelis and the Palestinians alike. And we must remember that we were able to help the parties reach their agreement because of our leadership and engagement, and because we have had the resources to support the nations that took risks for peace. In our own hemisphere, we've seen a dramatic movement toward open societies and open markets in a region that is the fastest growing market for U.S. exports. When the hemisphere's democratic trend was threatened by the dictatorship of thugs in Haiti, it was America's decisive action that restored legitimate government. When free markets were threatened by the financial crisis in Mexico, it took our leadership, American leadership, to restore confidence. In Africa, we've been engaged on a continent that has now reached a crossroads, a point at which sound policies and steady international engagement can make the difference between poverty and growth, between war and peace. That is why we've made a vigorous effort to encourage democracy in that continent, to resolve conflicts, promote trade and investment. It is why we are working to create an African crisis response force that would enable the countries in the region to respond to emergencies with their own troops, but with financial and logistical support from the United States and our allies. In all of these areas, the record we have forged is the best argument for a principled and robust policy of American engagement. Because our military might, because of our economic might, because we are trusted to uphold universal values, there are times when only the United States can lead. We must exercise this leadership, not because leadership is an end in itself, but because it is necessary to advance the interests and ideals of the nation. As I went through the accomplishments of the last 4 years with you today, I did so deliberately to lay a basis for the need for American leadership and the need for resources to back that American leadership, because that is the central lesson of our era. Because the United States led a century that was never safe for democracy is now ending with peace and freedom ascendant. The end of the Cold War has only strengthened the imperative of American leadership. As President Clinton said recently, this is the greatest age of human possibility in history, and that gives us special opportunities, but it also imposes special responsibilities. You know, the need for American leadership is rarely questioned in our country, yet today our ability to lead is open to question. And let me explain why. No one in public life will stand up and say, we can afford to retreat. No one will say we can ignore our commitments or build a wall around America. Members of Congress don't call me up to say, close some embassies, lower the flag, and bring our diplomats home by Christmas. On the contrary, Congress calls to protest whenever we reluctantly decide that we must close a mission because Congress has cut back our funding. What is more, while cutting our budget, Congress regularly calls on us to increase our global engagement by, for example, enlarging NATO, supporting the independence of Russia's neighbors, promoting investment in Africa, or protecting workers' rights in Asia, to mention just a few of the things that we're regularly called on by the Congress to do. Of course, Congress is absolutely right that we ought to do those things. They're right to do. But our foreign policy will not be sustained by rhetoric or good intentions. Talk is cheap. Leadership certainly is not. Leadership in foreign policy does require resources, enough to keep our embassies open and our people trained, enough to maintain constructive relations with the world great powers, enough to multiply our leverage through international institutions, enough to provide targeted aid to struggling democracies that one day can emerge as allies and very strong export markets for us, enough to meet threats like terrorism and international crime. I want to emphasize again the point I made earlier. We would not have been able to achieve the result that was achieved last night in the Hebron Agreement and the related agreements without constant engagement, without our leadership, and without the resources to support those parties that have taken risks for peace. There's no free lunch. You can't do it on the cheap. You have to have made the investments in order to provide the leadership. So I say the biggest crisis we're facing in our foreign policy today is whether we will spend what we must to have an effective American foreign policy. Since 1985, our spending on international affairs has been slashed by 50% in real terms, 50%. Our budget for foreign affairs is now just over 1% of our overall federal budget. The amazing thing is that these cuts have not been accompanied by any serious congressional debate. They've not been motivated by some reassessment of our interests in the world. As I said before, everyone is for U.S. leadership in principle, but some people simply think that we can have it without paying the price. As a result, we are endangered by a new form of isolationism that demands American leadership, but deprives America of the capacity to lead. One casualty of our inadequate resources, if the cuts continue, will be the principle of universality in our representation abroad, the principle that there should be a U.S. mission in virtually every country. Budget cuts have forced us to close 24 consulates and several embassies during my tenure. If the hemorrhaging continues, we will have no option but to close more of these important facilities. In an unpredictable world, we need a voice in every nation in the world. In the last few years, we've seen over and over again how vital our presence can be, often in unexpected places at unexpected times. For example, over 170 nations from Albania to Zambia had an equal say in extending the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and approving the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. They had also, and importantly from this point, an equal need to be persuaded by on-the-spot American diplomacies, and it happened over and over again. We could not have negotiated the Dayton peace agreement if we had not had embassies in each of the former Soviet Yugoslav republics. We needed people on the ground in every Balkan capital to gather information, to conduct negotiations, to spotlight atrocities, to prepare the way for our troops, and not the least to symbolize our commitment to that troubled region. Likewise, we almost certainly could not have convinced Belarus and Kazakhstan and Ukraine to give up their nuclear weapons if we had not decided to open embassies there in each of the new independent states when the Soviet Union broke up. And yet I fear that if we face a situation today like the breakup of the Soviet Union, we could not afford to open the new embassies or provide the necessary facilities. Budget cuts have also forced the people of our country who serve abroad to work under really intolerable conditions in many, many instances. Our diplomats in Beijing work with obsolete technology in decaying buildings. At our embassy in Angola, which is the focal point, as you know, for ending talks, that country's 2 decades-long civil war, our people there work out of a makeshift trailer park. Our embassy in Tajikistan is run out of a Soviet-era hotel. It's a hotel. It's the kind of place where utilities can go off for days at a time, and our diplomats have to carry jugs of water up the stairs for their drinking. And yet these are the people that we call upon when Americans get in trouble, when our companies need help to crack new markets, when we need to track down terrorists and drug lords, when we need a presence for our national security. One of the principal tools of diplomacy, of course, is foreign assistance. These programs give us the leverage our diplomacy needs to be effective. They help us prevent conflict and catastrophe around the world. As crisis after crisis has shown, the cost of prevention is never as great as the price of neglect. For example, we've already spent nearly as much in dealing with the short-term crisis in Rwanda and Burundi as we were able to spend last year to promote the peace and development all of Africa. And so the cost of prevention always is cheaper than the cost of dealing with the crisis. Our assistance programs have declined by 37% in real terms in the last 10 years. Half of our bilateral aid now supports the Middle East peace process, and of course these funds are vital, as I said, and must be fully preserved. But I have to tell you that aid to Israel and Egypt and Jordan will inevitably come under pressure, possibly irresistible pressure, if our other assistance programs continue to be decimated and this imbalance between aid to that part of the region and the whole rest of the world, if that imbalance grows. Our diplomats also help America compete in the global economy. Indeed, in the last 4 years, we've achieved, I believe, a major cultural change in our embassies. They are now aggressively supporting American companies in winning and carrying out contracts abroad. American leaders have repeatedly told me how much they've been helped by this aspect of what I call our America Desk effort. But now I'm hearing another message from these business leaders. They say our ambassadors are striving mightily to be helpful, but the personnel cuts have left them stretched too thin to do what they want to do to be helpful. Another casualty has been our support for international institutions, including the international financial institutions and the United Nations. For 50 years, the United States has led in the United Nations because it is a valuable tool for advancing our interests, and that's certainly no less true today than before, indeed more true with the emergence of the global issues. Now we face stark alternatives in connection with the United Nations. We can continue to meet our global challenges through the UN, where we share the burden with over 180 nations. Or we can try to meet those challenges alone, forcing our soldiers to take all the risks and our taxpayers to foot all the bills. This is the choice we must make. In considerable part because of U.S. arrears, the United Nations is hobbled in doing tasks of great importance to American interests in peacekeeping, in refugee operations, in human rights, in world health, to take only a few examples. By failing to pay our dues, we are compromising our ability to shape a smaller, leaner, but more effective United Nations. Nevertheless, I'm glad to say that our campaign for reform at the UN has begun to make progress. As you know, the UN has a new Secretary General, a leader with the ability and conviction to make the UN an effective institution for the next century. The United Nations must do its part, but so must the United States. It's time to pay our dues and our debts. It's time to recognize that we cannot reform and retreat at the same time. More broadly speaking, it is time to recognize that we have a vital national interest in adequately funding our international efforts. Just as we need to preserve our military readiness by maintaining forces and bases around the world, we need to preserve our diplomatic readiness by supporting the people and the programs that help to keep our soldiers out of war. In a world of real dangers, the failure to maintain diplomatic readiness will inevitably shift the burden of leadership to our military. And the cost will be measured in terms of lost opportunities and lost lives. Our Defense Department has wisely designed a strategy to cope with two nearly simultaneous regional conflicts at the same time. While our Defense Department has this two-crisis capability, the State Department is in danger of having a no-crisis budget. We cannot respond to a crisis in one part of the world without taking from other valuable programs in other regions. To support our deployment in Haiti, for example, we had to cut our aid to Turkey. To monitor the ceasefire in northern Iraq, we had to shortchange the peace process in Guatemala. Indeed, if a new crisis occurred today someplace in the world, we would have to make a very painful choice. Which long-term interest, probably an already underfunded long-term interest, which long-term interest should be sacrificed to meet the new crisis? I urgently and earnestly call on the Congress today to reassess the erosion that has taken place in our diplomatic readiness and to support, on a bipartisan basis, the President's international affairs budget. This is a challenge that must be met if we're to maintain our strength in the next century. Pardon me. As I leave this wonderful office I've been privileged to be in for the last 4 years, I have many reasons to be optimistic about the future. I know that time and again, from Haiti to Bosnia to Mexico to Russia to China, President Clinton has made the tough and correct decisions that leadership requires, and I know he will continue to make them. I know that my successor, Ambassador Albright, will be an eloquent and effective advocate for America's tradition of global engagement. I know that with any reasonable support, the men and women of the Foreign and Civil Service will keep on advancing our interests in every part of the world, despite the hardship and danger that they accept and endure. I'm optimistic because I know the American people stand with us. I've seen it as I've traveled around our country. Americans are proud we are the world's leading nation, and they understand. They understand better than the people in Washington that leadership carries responsibilities. They see the evidence that so often the isolationists miss. The evidence that security of our nation depends upon the readiness of our diplomats as our first line of defense, that the safety of our streets depends on our fight against drugs and terror abroad. The jobs at home depend upon the health of the global economy. I'm also optimistic because my own career has spanned a very inspiring period of American history and America's involvement in the world. Unless we're in for a big surprise, I'll be the last Secretary of State who served in World War II. My memories of that time and my experiences of the last 50 years teach me to have confidence in the choices that Americans will make. After I left law school in 1949, I went to work, as Joe said, for Justice William O. Douglas. As I was ending my year with him, I asked him for some advice. He responded, "Get out into the stream of history and swim as fast as you can." Well, I got out a bit further than I ever imagined I would, certainly, in 1950. But let me tell you just for a minute or two what I saw along the way. I saw a whole generation of leaders of both parties who recognized our interest in helping Germany and Japan rebuild so they could become our strong allies and trading partners. I saw the American people make the investments that paid off in half a century of peace and prosperity and in freedom's victory in the Cold War. Now, as Secretary of State, I've seen former political prisoners like Havel and Mandela lead their country as presidents. I've seen former adversary states on their way to becoming our allies. I've seen once impoverished countries become our leading export markets. All over the world, people credit the United States for helping achieve this transformation, and they look to us to continue to lead. Today, as before, alliances mean peace. Engagement means greater security. Leadership brings friends to our side. And your generation, the generation of young people I see sitting out in front of me here, have an even greater opportunity than mine. You have the key that unlocks the door to another American century. But you also have the responsibility to make the investments my generation made, the investments that leadership demands, the investments that if you make them will make this an even safer, freer, better, more prosperous, more secure world. Thank you very much.
We have time now for a few questions from Harvard students. There are 2 microphones on the floor here, 2 in the balcony. Please keep the questions brief and 1 per customer.
Good afternoon. My name is Joanne Fan. I'm a first year at Kennedy School. You mentioned that the United States has been indispensable in keeping the stability in Asia. That stability has been threatened in early 1996, in which China was conducting sorts of military and missile tests. And I commend U.S.'s commitment to peace in sending the warships to avoid further deterioration. In light of China's increasing military budget, its alleged arms sales to Pakistan and Iraq, as well as the recent accord with Russia in procuring more advanced weaponry, what would you advise the new Secretary of State Albright in conducting engagement, and what are the strategic priorities? In addition, Taiwan has aspired to become part of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and it had done a lot of work in meeting the criteria of the organization, but has not been admitted. What would you advise the Taiwanese government in doing in expediting its membership application?
There's a certain violation there of the one per customer. But if you ask me more than one, I get to answer whichever one I want, you see. So I'll say a few words about where I think our policy stands now and what I think Ambassador Albright will do. I think our policy of engagement with China is the right policy. I believe that we have reached a point with them where the quality of the dialogue has improved. We're able to find a number of areas of agreement, such as policies in Northern Asia and policies with respect to proliferation and policies with respect to the environment. We do continue to have serious differences with them on a number of issues, but I think engagement enables us to help manage those issues. I believe that China would be considerably more dangerous to us if we sought to isolate China or sought to contain China. Indeed, that would be a prescription for turning a country which I think can be a good dialogue partner in the United States into an adversary, and that's what we ought to try to avoid. We ought to maintain a dialogue with China so that we can discuss these differences and we can emphasize the areas of commonality. I believe that based upon her testimony and the things that Ambassador Albright said, is she will continue to support that approach to relationships with China. As you know, there are high-level meetings planned for 1971, beginning with a meeting between Vice President Gore and his opposite number, Li Peng, in China, which will emphasize an area of great common interest between us, and that is the protection of the environment.
Hello, Mr. Christopher. My name is James Johnson, and I'm a fellow Californian from Long Beach. My question is that some of us in the state are getting a little bit tired of the current administration, the governor of California, Pete Wilson, and there's been some speculation. Well, anyway, I live in LA County, a little too close to Orange County, but there's been some speculation that you may make a run at the next time. I'm wondering if you want to comment on that, or if you have any who you'd like to see run if it's not going to be you.
Well, I appreciate that nice compliment. One thing I know I'm not going to do is to run for public office. You know, I feel very young, I feel wonderful, but when I look in the mirror, I'm reminded that I'm 71 years old. It's a little too late to start an elective office career, but thanks for your nice words. Speaking of that, is there anybody here from North Dakota? Great, terrific. You get the next question.
We will indeed violate procedure and let North Dakota have the next one.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'm Carlton Larson from Dickinson, North Dakota, and a senior in Harvard College. You may be happy to know the citizens of Medora are very excited about the visit you suggested last year here, and we hope to all welcome you home sometime in the near future. My question concerns something you brought up, and that is the tools and the institutions that our diplomats abroad have. And one thing that has come under criticism in recent weeks has been the institution of diplomatic immunity. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on total diplomatic immunity and whether this is an institution that ought to be in some sense revised or reconsidered, and what role it has or should and ought to play in carrying out our foreign policy goals.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to have a question from a fellow North Dakotian. Dickinson, where he is from, at least when I grew up there, was a big city of 6,000, about 60 miles northeast of Scranton, and we used to go to Dickinson when we wanted to have a really important trip. So
They still do that in Scranton.
I'm sure that's true. Every time I got ready to go back to Medora, I found I was about to take off on some foreign trip, and I'm sorry it never quite happened. You know, the principle of diplomatic immunity is exceedingly important, and no more so for any country than the United States. You can see that when you think of the risk that our diplomats would be at if they are there and in countries where the rule of law is not as ingrained as it is in our country. If one of our diplomats was picked up in another country and was charged with offenses and the rule of law or the court system was not a reliable one, it could become a very serious situation. Just to give you an example, in Cuba today, we have an interest section there. We have diplomats working under very adverse conditions. Now, if they had to run the risk of being arrested and tried in a court system for some offense there without the protection of diplomatic immunity, I think that the system would be unworkable. On the other hand, I think we need to promote a willingness on the part of governments to refrain from claiming diplomatic immunity in those situations where there is a very serious criminal offense that's totally unrelated to the work or the conduct of the diplomatic function. And that's why I felt comfortable in asking President Shevardnadze of Georgia to waive diplomatic immunity. I was very pleased that he had the courage in that situation, that tragic situation in Washington, to indicate that he is prepared to waive diplomatic immunity. Now the authorities in Washington, D.C. can proceed on that tragic accident to determine whether they wish to bring charges. And I hope that other nations will, in the right circumstances, be prepared to waive diplomatic immunity. But fundamentally, I think it's of great importance to the United States, just as it was all through the Cold War when our diplomats were serving in countries where you couldn't have very much confidence in the judicial system. Thanks very much.
Yes, I'm Richard Sobel, and I studied the domestic forces behind foreign policy. You mentioned very eloquently American leadership around the world, and in particular in Bosnia. You also mentioned concern for an isolationist trend and yet a sense of the sensibility of the American people. It took quite a while for America to exercise leadership in Bosnia, America and the Europeans. I'm curious what role the sense of both the isolationism and the sensibility of the American public had in the slowness of the leadership, and then ultimately what made the Clinton administration decide to exercise that leadership.
I think the role of the American people, the role of public opinion, always has a influence on American foreign policy, and I think it ought to. I don't think there's anything improper about taking into account the attitudes of the American people. After all, this is a democracy, and those who say somehow that foreign policy ought to be abstracted from the views of the American people simply miss the point, in my judgment. With respect to Bosnia, it never was an issue that rose very high in the polls. There was a very strong attitude in some parts of the country, and certainly in the press, but nevertheless, the president felt the burden of that terrible war and finally took action, took the leadership role when it appeared that the Europeans simply were not prepared to take that leadership role. We felt that the United States had to do it, that war threatened not only the citizens of that country, but threatened the whole region. We took the action, we took the risks. Peace has been brought to Bosnia. There's certainly a difficult transition underway now, but I think the American people, to go back to your point, I think the record that our troops have made there, the fact that there have been, I think, no casualties, no American casualties from combat there, have given the American people a sense of confidence in our ability to maintain that kind of an endeavor, and the President is prepared to go forward with that, trying to give the people of that country an opportunity to have a reconstructed country, to create jobs and to create a multi-ethnic society. But at the end of the day, of course, it's up to the people of that country. The United States and its allies can provide an atmosphere, an environment of security for a period of time, but ultimately the people of that country will have to find their own destiny. And for myself, I think that if we can help to create jobs, if we can give the people a way to work together. I notice that people, if they have jobs and are working in a factory, they don't pay so much attention to their religion or their race. They're interested in getting their jobs done, and we need to try to create that sense of belonging to a country in Bosnia and having a chance to be part of a successful society. That's a key factor in my judgment.
Other balcony?
Hi, my name is Abigail, and I'm an undergrad at the college. I was struck by the urgency behind the need for American universality, and it seems that in history it's shown that America is not always the best equipped to deal with the problems in other countries. It seems that we're often not willing to meet other countries where they're at. For example, in the Tiananmen incident in China, there were people who criticized the United States for filling the students with a desire for democracy, a sense of injustice, when in fact the Chinese people may not be educationally or culturally prepared to participate in democracy. My question for you is, how can we reconcile our need for effective American foreign policy with avoiding cultural imperialism? And is there a possibility of partnership with Japan, of partnership with the European powers in dividing up the world into spheres where we can learn to deal with the proper culture and the issue of human rights?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and one I think we've all thought about a good deal. If I can divert for just a minute, I was very struck by the interview with the new Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, basically the earmuff story, where he said that he had gone to a football game hesitant to wear earmuffs, and it was very cold weather, but by the second half he decided he needed to put earmuffs on or he was going to have frozen ears. And what that taught him is that you ought to pay some attention to what the people who live there, how they feel and what they do. On the other hand, I wouldn't carry that idea too far, because I think the United States needs to continue to project the idealism that is perhaps our greatest ultimate resource. When you get right down to it, people around the world, for all of the detractions that the United States might have and for all the problems people see, they nevertheless respect our idealism. They understand our 200-year-old democracy is one of a kind, and I think that is an invaluable resource for the United States. So I'm not for adjusting to other people's cultural ideas if that means that we don't continue to project the idealism of our democracy and of our set of values. In human rights work, which I've been so deeply involved in all of my career, I understand the need for patience and understanding and the fact that there will be no overnight miracles and we have to work steadily. But that doesn't in any way, in my view, detract from the importance of continuing to have that beacon, be that signal out there for the rest of the world to watch. I wouldn't believe in trying to carve the world up in spheres of influence. I think that's old think. I think the new think is that we ought all to try to follow, understand, believe in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we ought all stand for those principles and move to those as rapidly as we can.
Thank you. My name is Avery Gardner, and I'm a senior at the college. And I'd like to talk about Congress's reluctance to fund the Secretary of State's office.
I'd like to talk about that, too.
Great. It seems like part of the problem is the public's relative apathy towards foreign affairs as opposed to domestic affairs. It seems like Congress gets a lot of pressure from the public to fully fund entitlement programs and other domestic efforts. But perhaps the public does not put the pressure on Congress on the foreign sphere. In that case, a big part of solving the problem would be convincing the public that they ought to call on their congressmen and senators for greater appropriations to the Secretary of State's office. Would you agree with that, and how would you do it?
You know, I think you've identified a very important problem. Somebody has said that foreign policy is a little bit like the electricity. As long as it's on, you don't miss it, but when it goes out, a lot of things cause you trouble, and that certainly is true. People do tend to take for granted the safe conduct of foreign policy. It's only when something goes wrong that they become excited about it. But I wouldn't use that particular metaphor or analogy as an excuse for not doing more. Frankly, we have not carried our case well enough to the American people. Under the leadership of Assistant Secretary Nicholas Burns, I think we've started a vast new program of attempting to reach out to the American people, participating in talk shows around the country, having many open forums in cities around the country, being on the internet, trying to modernize our approach to the people of the United States. And we're having some success in that. I look forward to a better educated America on the importance of foreign policy. Another rather simple thing that we ought to do is to begin to talk to more diverse audiences, not limit ourselves to foreign relations committees, and I confess not even limit ourselves to the very important audiences at the universities, even though they do have a great multiplier effect, but to get out and talk to community groups and labor groups and people who are not traditionally engaged in foreign policy. We've got a lot of work to do. We share some of the blame. The problem is, in a way, us as well as it is with the Congress, because Congress is in many senses only a mirror of the American people. So we need to have a better mirror to reach out.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Secretary Christopher has a meeting in the White House this afternoon, and so we have to stay on schedule. Work's not over yet, but on Monday afternoon, he returns to California for a well-deserved rest, and I hope you will join me in thanking him for 4 years of devoted service to this nation.
It was good to go after.